Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're taking a pretty wild trip today, going way back, to explore the whole history of plant evolution.
Yeah.
We're talking billions of years, folks, how those very first really simple life forms became the amazing diversity of plants we see all around us today.
It's interesting when you think about it. Plants weren't actually the first living things to try out life on land.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there's evidence that long before plants even showed up, you had cyanobacteria, and even some other multicellular eukaryotic organisms already hanging out in freshwater environments. And we might be talking like a billion years ago.
Wow. So it wasn't like some sudden massive green explosion on land.
No, no, it was more like a slow and steady spreading out.
I see. So gradual takeover, like a sneaky green invasion.
That's a fun way to think about it. And the thought is that those complex multicellular things that could photosynthesize and that we actually call plants, they started popping up on land around 850 million years ago.
So already pretty far back. Oh, yeah, for sure.
But the story we're really diving into today, you're saying it really starts with what are called the embryophytes,
Right, the embryophytes.
which are the true land plants. And they're making their grand debut in the fossil record around 470 million years ago.
Yeah, in the Ordovician period.
So the Ordovician, a lot of our listeners are probably familiar with these periods, but just to paint the picture, we're talking some serious ancient history here. And our goal in this deep dive, we really want to give you a clear and easy to follow overview of this whole evolutionary saga, hitting those big milestones and the crazy adaptations that made it all happen.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's dive into that initial move onto land, those first brave steps. The current thinking is that land plants, they actually share a common ancestor with freshwater green algae, specifically these guys called pterophytes.
Pterophytes, all right.
And that split might have happened, around 850 million years ago.
It's a similar time frame to those first multicellular photosynthesizers you mentioned.
Yeah, it all lines up. And what's interesting is that scientists are still trying to figure out exactly what those algal ancestors looked like. Were they these branched filaments or maybe more like single-celled charophytes that somehow managed to live on land? It's a fascinating puzzle.
It is. And it probably wasn't a solo mission, right?
You got it.
Huh.
There's growing evidence that early partnerships with fungi might have been crucial in those very first steps onto land. They needed a little help, those early pioneers.
That makes sense.
Yeah, because, think about it. Making that transition from a nice, stable, watery home to this unpredictable and often brutal world on land, that's no small feat.
No kidding. You've got the constant threat of drying out, which is like, the number one concern.
Desiccation, yeah. A big one.
Want a cozy, nutrient-rich soil like we have today. And even just like standing upright against gravity, that's a whole new challenge.
Exactly. You got to invent all these new ways to survive and thrive.
So how did they do it? What were those first critical adaptations?
Okay, so let's rewind the clock way back to around 470 million years ago. We've got these things called cryptospores. They're some of the earliest evidence of plant life on land.
Cryptospores. So we're talking like tiny, tiny things.
Microscopic, yeah.
Oh, okay.
But what's cool is that they have these tough, waterproof walls made of a material called sporopollenin. Think of it as nature's ultimate defense against drying out.
So they came prepared.
They did, and here's the kicker. These early spores, they look a lot like the spores of modern liverworts.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Interesting. So already some hints of those familiar plant groups we see today.
definitely. And then a bit later, around 455 million years ago, we find trilete spores. These are more like the spores of vascular plants, and they have this cool Y-shaped mark called a trilete mark. It suggests that these plants were already developing ways to prevent desiccation, a major win for life out of water.
Right, because water loss is a constant battle on land.
Absolutely. And along with these spores, we also see these early megafossils. They're larger thalloid organisms, and we find them in ancient waterlogged environments. They basically couldn't handle drier conditions, so they stuck close to the water.
So they weren't venturing too far inland just yet.
Not yet. It seems like two main strategies evolved to deal with this whole water scarcity issue.
Yeah.
You had the bryophytes, think mosses and liverworts, that either lived in perpetually moist areas or could basically go dormant and wait for water to return.
So they played it safe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then you had the trichiophytes, the vascular plants. They went for true resistance, They develop that waxy outer layer of the cuticle to significantly reduce water loss.
Like a built-in raincoat?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
But of course, they still needed to breathe to take in CO2 for photosynthesis, so that's where the evolution of stomata comes in.
Right, those tiny pores that can open and close.
Exactly. A brilliant innovation that allowed for controlled gas exchange.
So we could manage their water and CO2 levels much better than those early megafossils we talked about.
Precisely. And that brings us to one of the most transformative leaps in plant evolution, the development of vascular tissue in tracheophytes.
Vascular tissue, that's the internal plumbing system, right?
Yes, it's this intricate network of specialized cells that transport water and nutrients throughout the plant. But it's not just about transport. This vascular tissue also provided structural support, allowing plants to grow upright, away from the water's edge.
So a kind of internal skeleton.
In a way, yes. And this innovation was truly game-changing. It opened up so many new possibilities for plants to colonize diverse land habitats and eventually evolve into the larger, more complex forms we see today.
It's amazing how one key adaptation can have such far-reaching consequences.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that this whole move to land didn't happen in isolation. It has some pretty significant ripple effects on the planet itself.
Oh, right. We can't forget about the bigger picture.
Exactly. So if we zoom out a bit, it's believed that the rise of early land plants might have actually played a role in those dramatic snowball Earth glaciations.
Whoa, really? Those massive global freeze-overs.
Yeah. By absorbing atmospheric CO2 through photosynthesis, those early plants might have actually reduced the greenhouse effect, potentially contributing to those long, icy periods.
So they were inadvertently changing the climate.
It seems so.
Right.
And then, as plant life became more widespread, the increasing levels of oxygen in the atmosphere, that byproduct of photosynthesis, eventually reached a point where wildfires could occur.
Makes sense. You need enough oxygen to fuel those flames.
Right. And we see evidence of this in the fossil record with the appearance of charcoal starting about 0.45 billion years ago. It's like a smoky fingerprint of those early fires.
Wow, that's pretty cool. And even the Earth's geology was affected, right?
Exactly. We see a noticeable increase in mudrock deposits during the Ordovician and Silurian periods. And that's likely because land plants help to stabilize soil and retain mud in terrestrial environments.
So they were shaping the very landscape, from altering the atmosphere to changing the ground beneath them, or, well, beneath where their roots would eventually be. These early plants were a force to be reckoned with.
No doubt about it. They were pioneers, shaping the planet as they went.
Okay, so they've conquered land, at least to some extent. They're influencing the planet in all sorts of ways. Now, let's zoom in a bit and talk about how their life cycles evolved. Because it's more than just growing and reproducing, right? There's a whole other layer of complexity there.
Absolutely. And this is where we get to this fascinating concept called alternation of generations. It's a two-phase life cycle that all multicellular plants have.
2 phases. Okay, break it down for me.
Sure. You got the ganophyte phase, which is haploid, meaning it has one set of chromosomes and it produces reproductive cells called gametes. And then you have the sporophyte phase, which is diploid. It has 2 sets of chromosomes and it produces spores.
Okay, so ganophyte makes gametes, sporophyte makes spores. Got it.
Exactly. And in some algae, these 2 phases can look pretty much identical. We call that homomorphy. But in all modern land plants, they're distinct, a condition called heteromorphy. Different forms, basically.
So they don't necessarily look like twins anymore.
Right. And the evolutionary trend in plants seems to have been this move away from that identical appearance.
Makes sense. They're becoming more specialized.
Yeah.
So how did that play out in the different plant groups?
Well, if we look at the algal ancestors, they were likely mostly haploid, with just a brief diploid zygote stage after fertilization. But land plants, they're diplobiontic. Both the ganophyte and sporophyte phases are multicellular. And over time, we see this clear shift in which phase is dominant.
Dominant meaning.
Like which one is the bigger, more independent, longer-lasting phase.
Gotcha.
So in bryophytes, the gamophyte is the more prominent one. It's the longer-lived, independent phase. The sporophyte is usually smaller and often depends on the gametophyte. But in vascular plants, it's flipped. The sporophyte is the large, complex phase we usually think of as the plant, and the gametophyte is often much smaller and short-lived.
It's like a power shift in the life cycle.
That's a good way to put it.
Mm.
And ultimately, that shift towards a dominant diploid sporophyte was really important. It provided a kind of genetic resilience that helped fuel the diversification of land plants.
Okay, so why did this shift happen? Why did plants favor that diploid phase?
Well, there are a few ideas. One leading hypothesis is that having 2 sets of chromosomes in that sporophyte phase offers a kind of genetic backup. If one set has a harmful mutation, the other set can compensate, masking those negative
Like
effects.
a built-in safety net.
Exactly. This could have allowed for a larger, more complex genome to evolve without constantly risking those detrimental traits. However, it's not completely settled science. Some researchers argue that natural selection can work just as effectively in haploid phases.
Right, so still an open question. Fascinating stuff. Now, what about the origin of this whole two-phase life cycle itself? How did that even come about?
That's another great question. And there are a couple of main theories. One is called the interpolation theory. It suggests that multicellular sporophyte popped up as a brand new stage inserted between two Ganophyte generations. Imagine the zygote, instead of immediately going through meiosis, first goes through some rounds of regular cell division. This creates that multicellular diploid structure before finally producing spores. This theory fits well with what we see in bryophytes, where you have this relatively simple sporophyte growing out of the more complex gamophyte.
Okay, so it's like adding a new chapter to the life cycle story.
Precisely. The other theory, the transformation theory, suggests that the sporophyte came about by changing the timing of meiosis. Imagine a fully developed, multicellular haploid organism simply delaying meiosis to produce a diploid version of itself. That could explain why in some algae, the sporophyte and gamophyte look so similar.
It's like changing the order of events in the story.
Mm-hmm.
Fascinating how different evolutionary paths could lead to this same fundamental structure.
It is, and it speaks to the power of natural selection to shape life in so many different ways.
All right, so they've got these intricate life cycles figured out. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty. How did the actual anatomy of plants evolve to make life on land possible?
A crucial aspect of early plant anatomy is this thing called arbuscular mycorrhizal symbiosis.
Say that 3 times fast.
Right. It's a mouthful, but it's super important. Basically, we don't see true roots in the earliest land plants, those from the Silurian and early Devonian periods.
So how were they getting nutrients and staying anchored?
Well, some had root-like structures called rhizoids, but they weren't as efficient as true roots. And these early plants also lacked the sophisticated vascular systems that we see in most plants today. A great example is Aglaophyton, a vascular plant from the Devonian Rhynie-chert.
Rhynie-chert, that's one of those famous fossil sites, right?
It is a treasure trove of early plant fossils. And Aglaophyton, it didn't have true roots, but it did something really clever. It formed this close partnership with glomeromycota fungi.
Those are the fungi that help plants with nutrient uptake, right? The ones that form those mycorrhizae.
Exactly. And these fungi, they form these intricate tree-like structures called arbuscules inside the plant stem tissues. This created a network for exchanging resources.
So like an underground trading post?
I like that analogy. The fungi would get sugars from the plant,
Right.
and in return, they provided the plant with essential nutrients, especially phosphate, which is hard to get from the soil without roots.
Makes sense. So teamwork was key, even back then.
Definitely. And this ancient partnership with fungi that first appeared around 1 billion years ago, it might have been absolutely essential for plants to get a foothold on land.
Wow, that's a long-lasting relationship.
It is. And even today, these glomeromycota form mycorrhizal associations with most land plants, highlighting how important these symbiotic relationships are.
It's a classic example of how cooperation can drive evolution.
Absolutely. Now, along with these fungal partnerships, plants needed other adaptations to survive out of water, especially if they wanted to keep photosynthesizing. They had to figure out how to control water loss while still taking in carbon dioxide. This led to the evolution of 3 interconnected features: the cuticle, stomata, and intercellular spaces.
Okay, so a 3-pronged approach to water management.
You got it. First, there's the cuticle, that waxy outer layer we talked about. It acts as a barrier to prevent excessive evaporation.
The plant's raincoat.
Exactly. But of course, that raincoat also blocks the uptake of CO2, so that's where stomata come in. These tiny adjustable pores on the plant surface allow for regulated gas exchange. And finally, intercellular spaces within the photosynthetic tissues help distribute CO2 more efficiently to the chloroplasts, where photosynthesis happens.
So they optimize the whole system for both water retention and CO2 uptake.
Clever.
Very clever. And this whole setup allowed for better homeohydry, which is the ability to maintain a stable internal water content.
And that becomes even more important as CO2 levels in the atmosphere start to decline, right?
Exactly. With less CO2 available, plants had to open their stomata more often to take it in, which unfortunately also meant losing more water. This created a greater need for more efficient water transport systems.
Which brings us to xylem, that specialized water-conducting tissue.
You got it. Early land plants transported water in a pretty simple way, mostly within the cell walls. But to grow larger and more complex, they needed an upgrade.
So xylem to the rescue. Precisely. And we see this evolution happening in stages. First, there were simple hydroids, similar to what you find in moss sporophytes. These elongated dead cells formed channels for water transport, but their thin walls couldn't handle much tension, limiting how tall these plants could grow.
They needed something stronger.
Exactly.
Exactly.
And by the mid-Silurian period, we see the appearance of xylem tracheids. These are wider cells with walls reinforced by lignin.
Lignin, that's the tough stuff that gives wood its strength, right?
Exactly. This lignin reinforcement meant the cells could resist collapsing under the tension created when water is pulled upwards, allowing plants to grow taller. Much later in the Cretaceous period, flowering plants and some other groups evolved vessels. These are even wider tubes, with no end walls, arranged end-to-end, allowing for super-efficient water transport.
So like a high-speed water highway.
Exactly. This allowed plants to get even larger and explore new ecological niches, like climbing vines. But it's worth noting that wood based on tracheids is generally lighter and potentially less vulnerable to cavitation, which is when air bubbles form and block water flow.
So it's a trade-off, more efficient transport with vessels, but maybe a greater risk of blockage compared to those sturdier but less efficient tracheids.
It's fascinating how evolution is always balancing these different factors.
Absolutely. And another important anatomical feature is the endodermis.
Okay, remind me, what does the endodermis do?
It's basically a layer of cells that surrounds the vascular tissue in roots. It probably evolved in the earliest roots during the Devonian period, although the first clear fossil evidence of it is from the Carboniferous period.
So it's like a gatekeeper for the root system.
That's a great way to put it. It carefully regulates the movement of ions and water between the groundwater and the plant's vascular system.
So it helps prevent any unwanted substances from getting in. Exactly. It also prevents pathogens from entering the vascular tissue and can even contribute to root pressure, helping to push water upwards when transpiration water loss from the leaves is low.
So it's a multitasking layer of protection and regulation.
Exactly. All these anatomical innovations work together, allowing plants not just to survive on land, but to thrive and diversify. It's a beautiful example of how evolution builds upon itself layer by layer.
It is. Now, let's shift gears and talk about plant morphology, the actual shapes and structures of plants. And there's no better place to start than with leaves, those essential solar panels.
Leaves are indeed the primary photosynthetic organs in most plants, and their origin seems to be linked to that decline in atmospheric CO2 levels we talked about earlier back in the Devonian period. With less CO2 available, plants needed more surface area to capture it efficiently.
Makes sense. You've got to maximize your sunlight catching potential.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that leaves seem to have evolved multiple times independently in different plant lineages.
So different groups came up with their own solutions.
Precisely. We broadly categorize leaves into two types, microphyls and megaphylls.
Okay, break it down.
Sure. Microphyls are typically small, with a single vascular trace running through them. They're found in lycopods, club mosses, and their relatives.
So simple and straightforward.
Exactly. Megaphylls, on the other hand, are generally larger and have a complex network of veins. We see them in ferns, horsetails, and seed plants.
More complex plumbing.
Right. And there's this classic idea called the telomere theory that tries to explain how those megaphylls might have evolved. It suggests they came from branching stem systems. First, you had overtopping, where some branches grew taller than others. Then, planation, where the whole branching system flattened out. And finally, webbing, where the spaces between those flattened branches filled in, creating a continuous leaf blade.
So it's like a branching stream merging into a flat delta.
That's a great analogy. And while the telomere theory is well supported by fossil evidence, there are alternative ideas out there. Some focus on different starting structures, like flattened ribbon-like tissues. And ultimately, research into plant genes suggests that the difference between stem-like and leaf-like structures might be more of a spectrum, controlled by how genes are expressed.
It's amazing how nature can find so many different ways to create such a fundamental structure. And it seems like the evolution of megaphylls, around 360 million years ago, happened right when CO2 levels continued to drop, which would have required higher densities of stomata for both cooling and CO2 uptake. But before megaphylls, there were microphylls. How did those simple leaves come about?
The innation theory proposes that microphyls, like those in club mosses, came from tiny spiny outgrowths on stems called innations. We see early evidence of these innations becoming vascularized, developing their own internal plumbing in early lycopods like Baragwanathia and Asteroxylon.
So from simple bumps to fully functional leaves.
That's the idea. It's a beautiful example of how evolution can repurpose existing structures for new functions.
It is. Okay, so we've got leaves figured out. Now what about roots? They seem so essential for anchoring plants and absorbing water and nutrients from the soil.
The evolution of roots had a massive impact, not just on plants themselves, but on the entire planet. They accelerated the process of weathering, breaking down rocks, and releasing those essential minerals.
So they were changing the composition of the soil itself.
Exactly. And they played a huge role in carbon sequestration, drawing carbon from the atmosphere and storing it underground. This likely had a significant impact on long-term climate regulation. But here's the thing. The very first land plants, back in the Silurian period, didn't have true roots.
So what were they using instead?
Many had prostrate stems lying along the ground, or they had these simple, hair-like structures called rhizoids for anchorage and absorption.
So like a prototype root system.
In a way, yes. And there's even evidence that rhizoids might have evolved before plants fully conquered land. We see rhizoid-like structures in the Caricaea, the group of algae considered to be the closest living relatives of land plants.
So it was a feature they brought with them, potentially?
Possibly. But rhizoids also likely evolved independently in different plant lineages because we see similar structures in lichens and even some animals.
So another example of convergent evolution, nature seems to love finding multiple solutions to the same problem.
Absolutely. Now, more complex, root-like structures that could penetrate deeper into the soil appeared in the Devonian period in groups like the Rhiniophytes and Trimerophytes.
So the roots were getting an upgrade.
Exactly. And then, in plants like Asteroxylon, we see the first evidence of true roots, distinct from stems and with a protective root cap at the tip.
So the roots we know and love today.
Exactly. And these roots in Asteroxylon actually evolved independently from those in other vascular plants.
Oh, wow. So roots have arisen multiple times throughout evolutionary history.
That's right. And the rhizophores of lycopods offer another example of this independent evolution. They seem to be modified stems that then give rise to rootlets, suggesting that roots evolved at least twice in the plant kingdom.
It's fascinating how such a crucial organ could arise through different evolutionary pathways.
It speaks to the fundamental importance of roots for life on land. Now, let's move on to another major morphological innovation, the evolution of the tree form.
Ah, trees. Hard to imagine the world without them.
I know, right? And greater height offered some major evolutionary advantages. Better access to sunlight, the ability to shade out competitors, and more effective dispersal of spores or seeds by wind. But to get that tall, you need a robust vascular system to transport water and nutrients up to the top, and you need woody tissue for support.
So you're talking about secondary growth, the kind of growth that produces wood and bark.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that a simple form of wood appears pretty early, around 400 million years ago, even before true trees existed.
So wood evolved for a different purpose initially.
It seems so. The thinking is that its initial role might have been more about strengthening the stem for water transport, not just for load bearing.
So the need for efficient water transport might have paved the way for the structural role of wood later on. Fascinating. So who were some of the first plants to achieve that tree-like form?
It seems like ferns might have been among the first. There's a species called Watiza that grew to around 8 meters tall in the Middle Devonian period. Pretty impressive.
That's a good-sized tree, even by today's standards.
It is. But it was the progymnosperms, a group that includes Archaeopteris from the late Devonian, that really nailed the whole true wood thing. These plants had a bifacial cambium, which produces wood inwards and bark outwards, and they formed extensive forests, reaching heights of up to 30 meters.
So the first true forests?
Pretty much. And then came the arborescent lycopods, the lepidodendrales, which dominated the late Devonian and Carboniferous forests. They could grow even taller, exceeding 50 meters. However, their growth was determinate, meaning they grew to a preset height, branched, reproduced, and then died. Unlike the indeterminate growth of many modern trees, which can keep growing taller throughout their lives.
So they had a more programmed life cycle.
Exactly. And eventually, the seed plants gymnosperms and later angiosperms took over as the dominant tree groups, with angiosperms diversifying and becoming prominent in the Cretaceous period.
It's a long and impressive lineage of plants reaching for the sky.
Now let's shift our focus from these towering trees to something much smaller but equally revolutionary in terms of plant reproduction: seeds.
Ah, yes. Seeds represent a major shift in how plants propagate, offering some significant advantages over spore-based reproduction.
So what were the key steps in this evolutionary journey? The transition from spores to seeds involved a crucial intermediate step: heterospore. This is the production of two distinct sizes of spores: small microspores, which develop into male gamophytes, and larger megaspores, which develop into female gamophytes.
So a division of labor in the spore world.
Exactly. And this ultimately led to the evolution of the ovule, which is essentially a megasporangium that produces only one functional megaspore, with the others degenerating. This megaspore is then retained within the sporangium as it develops. The key innovation was the enclosure of this developing female gamophyte within a protective, waterproof outer layer called the integument.
So greater protection for the developing embryo.
Precisely. And pollen grains evolved as a way to deliver the male gamete to the ovule, releasing their sperm cells only when they reach the female structures.
So targeted fertilization, it's all about increasing the chances of success.
Exactly. But some earlier plant groups got tantalizingly close to the seed habit without quite crossing the finish line. Lycopods like Lepidocarpon produced large megaspores that were surrounded by vegetative tissue and even germinated into a female gametophyte while still inside.
So they were almost there.
Almost. But they lacked a completely sealed inner layer, so they weren't fully resistant to desiccation, and sperm didn't have to actively penetrate tissue to reach the egg. Another fascinating find is a Middle Devonian fossil called Runcaria.
Roncaria, that's a new one for me.
It's a pretty cool fossil. It had an integumented megasporangium surrounded by another protective structure, but it still lacked a robust seed coat and a fully developed mechanism to guide pollen directly to the ovule.
So Roncaria gives us a glimpse into those evolutionary stepping stones leading to true seeds.
Exactly. It's a reminder that evolution is a gradual process, with lots of experimentation along the way.
So who are the first plants to crack the code and produce true seeds?
The first true seed plants, appearing in the fossil record during the late Devonian, are called pteridosperms, often called seed ferns. They evolved from progymnosperms and looked a lot like ferns in their foliage, but they had true seeds.
So they were hiding their revolutionary reproductive strategy in plain sight.
In a way, yes. These early seed plants were quite diverse, ranging from trees to shrubs, and they had ovules but hadn't yet evolved structures like cones or fruits to house them. The gymnosperms, with their naked seeds that are often borne on cone scales or surrounded by fleshy coverings called arils, and the angiosperms, with their fully enclosed seeds within a carpel, part of the flower, came later.
And that fully enclosed seed in angiosperms must have offered some major benefits.
Definitely. The seed coat provided even greater protection against desiccation and damage, allowing for seed dormancy the ability to survive tough conditions and germinate only when things are favorable.
So they could wait for the perfect opportunity.
Exactly. This opened up a whole new range of environments for colonization. Seeds also contain a stored supply of nutrients for the developing embryo, giving it a head start in life. This suite of advantages gave seed plants a real edge over earlier plant groups, contributing to a major increase in plant biodiversity.
It's a brilliant strategy. Now, from the resilience of seeds, let's move on to perhaps the most distinctive feature of the angiosperms.
Flowers.
Ah, flowers. Those exquisite structures that are uniquely adapted for reproduction in angiosperms.
They seem to be a relatively late addition to the plant evolutionary story.
That's right. They appear in the fossil record during the Cretaceous period, roughly 130 million years ago, and following their arrival, angiosperms experienced a period of rapid diversification and became the dominant plant group in most terrestrial ecosystems.
So they took the plant world by storm. They did. Before flowers, plant reproduction relied on structures called microsporophylls and megasporophylls, which are essentially modified leaves bearing pollen sacs or ovules. Flowers represent a major evolutionary leap, providing a whole new suite of mechanisms for attracting pollinators and ensuring successful fertilization.
And the origin of angiosperms themselves has been a bit of an evolutionary puzzle, hasn't it?
It has. The traditional view, based on plant morphology, suggested that angiosperms were closely related to the gymnosperms, specifically a group called the nettails. But more recent molecular studies, looking at plant DNA, indicate that the gymnosperms are a distinct lineage. Both groups likely arose from within the pteridosperms much earlier in plant history.
So the traditional view has been shaken up a bit.
It has, and the exact evolutionary relationships are still being investigated. but it's clear that angiosperms charted their own unique evolutionary course.
So what are some of the key features that set angiosperms apart in terms of reproduction?
Several things stand out. First, their ovules are enclosed and protected within a structure called a carpel, which itself evolved from a modified leaf. They also have a double integument, meaning the ovule has two protective layers instead of one, and their pollen grains typically have 3 cells. But perhaps the most remarkable feature is double fertilization.
Double fertilization. Remind me how that works.
Sure. One sperm cell from the pollen fuses with the egg cell to form the embryo, the developing plant. But a second sperm cell fuses with a central cell in the ovule to form the endosperm, a nutrient-rich tissue that nourishes the embryo. This double fertilization is a hallmark of angiosperm reproduction.
It's like a 2-for-1 deal for fertilization.
Exactly. It's incredibly efficient. And while some extinct plants, like the benetels, had flower-like structures, those evolved independently.
So another example of convergent evolution.
Right. Now, it seems like the earliest angiosperms might have had a preference for certain types of habitats.
Oh, really? What kind of environments did they favor?
Based on the fossil evidence and studies of their living relatives, it seems they likely originated in dark, damp, and frequently disturbed environments, like forest understories or stream banks.
So they weren't out in the open conquering vast landscapes just yet.
Not initially. They were more like niche specialists. This might have limited their early impact, but could have also provided the ecological flexibility that fueled their later diversification.
Makes sense. They honed their skills in those specific environments before branching out. And speaking of branching out, there have been some intriguing theories about the origin and rapid diversification of the flower itself, haven't there?
Definitely. One idea, the anthophyte theory, proposed a close relationship between angiosperms and the natales, a group of gymnosperms with some flower-like features. But that theory has largely been dismissed due to the molecular evidence. Another idea, the mostly male theory, has a stronger genetic basis. It points to the loss of one copy of a key regulatory gene called LFY.